Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It is great to see you all here on this gorgeous morning in New York. I'm Fred Dixon, President and CEO of NYC Company, the tourism and marketing organization for the city of New York. I am so pleased to be here today for what is the fourth iteration of the Nest Summit, and NYC Company is proud to continue to be a founding partner in this wonderful program. I am especially honored to be here today with our partner, Julia Simpson, President and CEO of the World Travel and Tourism Council. I want to thank WTTC for their leadership on the ever more urgent issues surrounding climate change and for partnering with us on this important dialogue as we advance a nature-positive approach to net zero travel and tourism. This week, we celebrate the 14th iteration of Climate Week NYC. As a community committed to sustainability, climate, and environmental justice, we are proud to serve as the global stage for these vital conversations happening all across our city this week in conjunction with the UN General Assembly. There is truly no better home for the Nest Summit than this remarkable facility, the Jacob K. Javits Center, one of the most sustainable convention centers in the United States. Under the visionary leadership of CEO Alan Steele, the Javits Center now boasts some remarkable achievements in sustainable stewardship and has become a model for how venues and business events can contribute positively to nature, biodiversity, and decarbonisation. I'm on the board of this organization, so I like to crow a little bit about it. The building is now home to one of the largest green roofs in the United States, which is now a sanctuary for 41 species of birds. Just yesterday, it was 38. And so they've identified 3 more birds in the last 2 days, including a bald eagle that's been flying across the Hudson just recently, and we're waiting for it to land so we can make it 42. It's also home to 5 species of bats and thousands of insects, 9 very productive honeybee hives. It is also home now to a 1-acre rooftop farm that produces an estimated 40,000 pounds of produce each year, some of which you might be consuming today. A 10,000 square foot rooftop orchard and a food forest, a 3,500 square foot all-season greenhouse, and 2 underground cisterns with a combined capacity to store 344,000 gallons of rainwater, which is repurposed for irrigation. They're doing terrific work. We are proud to have Alan as the chair of our sustainability committee at NYC Company, where we bring together travel and tourism leadership from across the 5 boroughs to focus on essential climate actions. His commitment to fostering a nature and climate positive ethos here at Javits is an example to us all and creates the perfect backdrop for today's conversations. It was wonderful to be here last night, in fact, with some of you I know that were in this room, to see Alan and the Javits Center honored by the Audubon Society for their work. So thank you all for joining us today. We have some great speakers lined up for you this hour, including a pioneering leader in this space, the former Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, as well as Travel Weekly Editor-in-Chief Arnie Weissman, who will moderate a panel on biodiversity. So Julia, thank you again for your partnership, and welcome to the Nest.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a great intro. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's really great to be back in New York and a privilege to address this forum today in what is an incredible Javits Center with its bald eagle. Fantastic. Nature is humanity's most precious resource. Our oceans, rivers, and forests are our means of survival. They give us food, water, and ways to travel. But they also do more than that. They preserve our well-being. They feed the human spirit. The poet Henry David Thoreau called it the tonic of wildness. The tops of mountains, he wrote, are the unfinished parts of the globe. We can never have enough nature. We must be refreshed. I think all of us in this room know a little of that feeling, that awe at the scale of the world. It's what drives us to live, to explore. And nature is therefore vital to our prosperity too. 50% of global GDP relies on it and depends on it. And if we take it for granted, we risk losing it for good. As early as 2030, biodiversity loss could shrink our global GDP by 2.3% every year. Our travel and tourism sector is perhaps more endangered than ever. More than half of global travel and tourism is driven by people's desire to explore our natural world. Its vast deserts, sweltering rainforests, and the rich diversity of wildlife. Ours is one of 6 economic sectors with over 80% of its goods and services highly dependent on nature. And our members, who represent the top 200 CEOs in the travel and tourism industry, want to preserve it. So last year for COP26 at WTTC, we produced the first ever sector-wide net zero roadmap for travel and tourism. We worked really hard to make it holistic, not addressing just one part of the climate challenge, but a range of interconnected problems: carbon emissions, sustainability, biodiversity, nature. And the result was a landmark plan setting out the immense role travel and tourism can play in building a more sustainable world. So what comes next? We want to keep up the momentum. The UN's next Biodiversity Conference, COP15, is fast approaching. Their governments will make decisions that will transform society's relationship with nature. It won't happen without travel and tourism, without the countless actions, tiny and huge, of companies all over the earth. And crucially, it won't happen without information. The knowledge and the evidence of the risks to our industries and how to tackle them. That's why at WTTC, we are publishing today a new report with Montreal. And this report will elaborates the crucial role that responsible travel and tourism can play in not just halting, but in reversing the destruction of nature. It's called Nature Positive Travel and Tourism, and it is part evidence and it's part manifesto, setting out the ideas and practical actions companies can take to become guardians of nature, protecting all our resources. From the forests on our land and the algae in our seas, which act as vast carbon sinks, to the mangroves that buffer settlements from rising seas. Events like this put nature and the climate at the top of the international agenda. Now all that remains is action, taking the steps to sustain our planet so that our planet in turn can sustain us, and so that it can provide that elusive tonic of wellness for many more generations to come. Thank you very much. And now we will focus on the travel and tourism sector's reliance on natural capital and the future opportunities for our sector. Our next guest is deeply passionate and an advocate in renewable energy and mitigating the effects of climate crisis, and he really is inspiring. He has brought worldwide attention to the climate emergency in Australia and called for the urgent need for the country's renewable energy overhaul. His passion and down-to-earth activism is something we all need sometimes to recharge our batteries with. So I am now delighted to introduce former Prime Minister of Australia, fierce climate change advocate, Malcolm Turnbull. Lovely to see you, please. So it's absolutely fabulous to have you with us, Malcolm, and it's beautiful weather, and we're in a great centre with 43 species of birds, which is great.
Yes, and waiting to get the announcement the eagle has landed too.
The eagle has landed, although it's not good appearing with stegosauruses, extinct or not. We're not happy about that, but anyway. Travel and tourism is obviously highly dependent on nature. That's why people travel, really. In what ways do you think governments can support the travel and tourism sector in taking a more nature-positive approach?
Well, the first thing governments have got to do is make sure the environment is looked after. And you should do that for its own sake, but it clearly has a big impact on the tourism sector. I mean, if you take Australia's Great Barrier Reef, which is gigantic, its area is about 80%, a little bit more in fact, of the area of the state of California, 2,300 kilometres long. We have, Australian governments, the government I led and predecessors and successors have all been putting enormous resources into supporting the Great Barrier Reef. It's got a number of threats. The biggest one, of course, is global warming, hence the warmer seas, hence breeding more heat-tolerant corals and seeking to propagate them. There's a lot of work being done on that. And of course, pests like the crown of thorns, starfish, doing our best to eradicate that, and of course stopping pollution. So, it's a multifaceted effort, but there are literally tens and tens of thousands of jobs, about 150,000 jobs, as I recall, depending directly on tourism on the Great Barrier Reef. So,
and can you rebuild the Great Barrier Reef? We were recently with the granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau, Alexandra Cousteau. She's a great oceanologist, and she was saying that in her grandfather's time to now, there's only a third of the species that we have in our oceans. But she was quite an advocate of not just trying to conserve things, but to try and rebuild back. Is that possible?
Yes, well, there is a laboratory in Queensland, in Townsville, that the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority operates, which seeks to identify corals which can thrive in warmer waters, because we've had the big coral bleaching events have come from a warmer ocean. Now, while we have to do everything we can to rapidly stop burning fossil fuels and move to net zero as fast as we can, there is a huge amount of momentum in this warming process. So we're going to be living with warmer seas, whatever happens. And so we need to have corals that are going to be able to live and thrive in a 2 degrees plus 2 degrees C world, which is where we're likely to head, and hopefully not any further. And so there's a lot of work being done on that. But, propagating corals over an area as large as the one I've described is quite a challenge. So anyway, they're absolutely on the case.
Fantastic. As former head of state, a former prime minister, and I know that you served as a minister for the environment and water as well, massively important in a place like Australia.
Yeah. Well, we don't have enough water.
Exactly.
Well, we either have
you have too much.
We either have too little or too much. Yeah.
I was wondering, what kind of policies and initiatives do you think have had a really positive impact on protecting nature and biodiversity?
Well, firstly, it's very important to restrictions on land clearing. Farmers, this is largely state jurisdiction. Okay, Australia's a federation like the United States, 6 states and 2 territories, but you have to have limitations on land clearing and measures to protect native vegetation. In terms of water, again, this will be very familiar to the Americans here. We have historically over-allocated our water resources, and this deprived the environment of water that it needed. So when I was water minister back in 2007, we essentially brought all interstate water under federal jurisdiction, under the Commonwealth Water Act, and we are returning, by acquisition and other measures, returning a lot of water to the environment. So, getting the balance right. But it is, all of these things are they're much harder to fix retrospectively than it is to get them right in the first place.
I'm interested, talking about a federal system, does that help or hinder? Because, if you've got one powerful voice, you're all going to do it this way.
Yeah.
Or does it actually create kind of healthy competition?
Well, the answer is a bit of both.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that on the environment, it's actually helped massively. We've had a really toxic sort of political conflict in Australia over climate, as it has been in the United States, to be frank, where it became an ideological issue. I lost my leadership over the centre-right party, which is in Australia's called the Liberal Party, but it's the centre-right, like the British Tories, really. I lost my leadership over on that party twice over my determination to do more on climate. So I'm sort of a recidivist in that respect. But it has been very toxic. But at the recent election, I think that was largely resolved with a very good result for the climate. But at the state level, even centre-right governments, like in New South Wales, have been very progressive on climate issues. So it's, politics is messy and complicated. The problem is, however, it doesn't matter how long the politicians debate or what they say or how, thundering the newspaper columnists are, the sheer physics of global warming is irresistible.
Yeah.
And that's why, saying you believe or disbelieve in global warming is like saying you believe or disbelieve in gravity. It kind of doesn't matter actually what you believe. If you step out of the second floor window, you will find the experiment very, very compellingly impactful, to say the least.
Looking at it from your point of view, what are some of the critical obstacles to overcoming biodiversity loss? I mean, you talked about land clearance, preventing things like that, but are there some key obstacles that we need to get to grips with?
Well, the fundamental one is just the pressure of development.
Yeah.
So, in Australia, the biggest threat to koala habitats is development. The expansion of suburbs and, into the, periphery of the cities, and, people want to build houses and, roads and so forth. So you just have to identify those habitats and make sure that they are protected. I think around the world, one of the biggest, after burning fossil fuels, the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions is deforestation. And I think the rich world has to do a lot more. Because if you have a community in a developing country with a forest, and they have the opportunity to cut that forest down, sell the timber, and use it to generate annual cash crops, that's a fairly attractive proposition. So it is vital to mobilise the money in the rich world, because after all, we put the CO2 up there. If you look at Pakistan's just been totally devastated, a third of the country flooded. I mean, Pakistan's current and historic contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is negligible. So we've got to mobilise the money, in other words, to make keeping forests and reforesting forests an economic proposition for the people who live there. And that will involve avoided deforestation. It will involve sustainable plantation forestry. Timber is the classic sustainable resource. You plant 1,000 trees, and in 20 years you cut them down and plant another 1,000 trees. And if managed well, it can actually be revived. I mean, the forests are, as we always say, the lungs of the earth, and neglecting them and not supporting them is a big part of the problem we face.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I heard you tell a story around economics and whaling, and I just wondered if you would repeat it, because actually a lot of this biodiversity movement has come out of people trying to run against the illegal wildlife trade. It's sort of, so please tell us that account.
Well, the answer is a whale is, leaving aside issues of sustainability and, being humane to animals and looking after our natural world, if you just reduce everything to money, let me tell you, a humpback whale is more valuable in the lens of a tourist on your whale watching boat than it is in the freezer of a whaling company. The reality is there is so much more money in whale watching as an industry, as a tourism industry, than there has ever been or could ever be in the whaling industry per se. And so that's the argument. When I was Environment Minister and I used to go to the International Whaling Commission meetings, which were basically all about trying to, most of the room trying to stop whaling and another section in the room wanting to continue it. One of our best arguments is to say, look, if you stop whaling and promote whale tourism, there is so much more economic return, so much more employment, and indeed for the maritime communities, the coastal communities that had hitherto been involved in whaling itself.
It's incredible. You talk about active challenges when you talk about countries setting targets. Could you explain a bit about, the active challenges? Are there countries that have set these active challenges that are making good progress in your view?
Yes, well, I think there are challenges. Yes, the answer is progress is patchy. Now, But nonetheless, if you've got to focus on an overall emission reduction target, plainly. So, we're just about everyone is targeting, net zero by 2050, but that we actually don't have until 2050, frankly. So the new government in Australia has targeted 43% reductions from 2005 levels by 2030, which is very achievable, and that's good. But you also have to target things that are more specific, and so that might be in the electricity sector a certain amount of long duration storage. I mean, if you think about the electricity transformation, which is a big part of this, because one of the reasons we've got all this greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is because of burning coal, mostly coal and oil and gas, but mostly coal. We've had electricity systems in pretty much every country, which has consisted of big thermal plants burning coal centralised, and then the electricity transmission lines running out from that. And we're now moving into an era where the cheapest form of new generation, overwhelmingly, and pretty much everywhere in the world, is solar PV and wind. And they are distributed. So you haven't just got a couple of big plants, they're all over the place. And of course, particularly in Australia, which has the highest per capita penetration of solar PV, we've got about a third of our households have got solar panels on the roof. So they're they're generating electricity for the household and then exporting the surplus.
Has the price of them come down? Because in the UK, where we don't have a lot of sun, by the way, but they're still exorbitantly expensive. Have the price
the price of PV has come down dramatically. We have had subsidies which continue, but they are modest nowadays. And to give you an idea, and this is the march of technology, it's a combination actually of Australian science, the University of New South Wales for the PV cells, and the incredible industrial scale of China, where about 85% of the solar panels are made. But the cost per watt, as in a measure of energy, is for solar PV has come down by over 90% in 10 years. So it is getting cheaper. But anyway, the bottom line is you need a different grid, you need to build the storage. We absolutely have the tools to do it, but you need to plan for it. I'm sure you've heard me say this before, we've got to replace ideology and idiocy with engineering and economics. And if we do that, we can get the job done.
Fantastic. So true. You are an advocate for very innovative solutions around renewable energy. Are there any innovations that you've seen that are making a really big difference? I know you talked to me about hydro as well, but...
Yeah. Well, I think I talked about solar. I mean, that's become a lot cheaper. Really, the reduction in the cost of batteries is very significant, and that's likely to improve, although there are a lot of very precious in some cases, but not especially abundant metals in batteries in the supply chain, which can become an issue. We've all seen the fragility of supply chains in recent years. I think probably if you're going to summarise, how do you get from where we are to zero emission energy world? The first thing is your primary generation overwhelmingly is wind and solar, nuclear in some places, hydro in some places. You back that up with pumped hydro for long duration storage, batteries for shorter storage periods. But then there is a chunk of our economy and industry that you cannot electrify. So, you can replace your petrol burning car with an EV, that's pretty straightforward. But if you want to make plastics, and you're not going to use methane, you're going to need to you're going to need hydrogen. And if you want heat, industrial heat, you may not be able to do that with electricity, you may need hydrogen. If you want long duration transport fuels for ships, again, green hydrogen is the key. So I think you've got electrification on the one hand, green hydrogen on the other. What is green hydrogen? Well, it's hydrogen, obviously, but it is made by electrolyzing water with renewable electricity. It's an experiment most of us did in science class. You put 2 electrodes in a glass of water and you see the hydrogen and the oxygen bubbling off, and that is basically what it is, and that is a super fuel, and it's completely green.
I was at a scientific conference the other day and heard a guy called Paul Stein, who's a scientist in the aviation sector, and he was actually talking about very small nuclear power stations. Now, I know nuclear fission is very controversial, but have you heard about this? Instead of building a $20 billion plant, you have these sort of slightly smaller ones. Do you have any views on them?
Yeah, this is called the SMRs, small modular reactors. And probably the best way to think about a small modular reactor is it's like a slightly bigger, typically it'd be a slightly bigger version of what you have in a nuclear-powered submarine. Now, the problem with the US and British navies is and the Russian Navy for that matter, they use weapons-grade uranium in those reactors, so I don't think anyone's going to want to have that. But France and China actually use low-enriched uranium. But essentially, it's a small reactor. The fact is, however, they have not been deployed commercially. Everyone's talking about it, and it is hugely expensive. So, whether it's in a submarine or in some kind of civilian application. So, I think yes, there's a case for it. Yes, I don't have any philosophical objection to it, but I have to say, in my country, in Australia, you could never justify nuclear power on economic grounds to generate electricity. You could justify it to support a nuclear navy. Now, at the moment, we're on a slightly different trajectory with nuclear submarines, but if you had nuclear submarines with civilian-grade uranium operating in the reactor, you would need to have some nuclear industry to support that. And so that might be how we would move to it. But I think honestly that, it's a bit like the sort of beta VHS struggle, back in the days of video recorders. It's like the better mousetrap for making electricity, renewable electricity, zero-emission electricity, is honestly wind and solar. But you do have to, you've got to be smart about it. There's a trade-off between extra transmission, so you get more resilience if you have more transmission, because if the wind's not blowing here, it might be blowing over there. If it's cloudy there, it might be lots of sun here. So more transmission gives you greater resilience, but that's expensive. And then you've got to match that with storage. So you might, for example, in your country, in the UK, you have a lot of wind in Scotland, huge amount of wind in Scotland, and of course in the North Sea, offshore wind. And the transmission lines down to the rest of the UK have got a certain capacity. So when there's too much wind, sometimes the grid operator has to pay the wind farms to literally abate, which is curtail their production, which is quite costly for them. The other thing they can do is pay the people who have the pumped hydro projects to take the electricity, which makes it a complete, fantastic thing for those people. So you have there's a lock. A lock is, as everyone knows, I'm sure, is a lake, but they're very in Scotland. But they've generally got very steep sides because they were carved by glaciers, very steep sides, and there are a couple of places there where you have a dam that has been built on top of the hill next to the lock. And so when electricity is cheap, or when they're being paid to take it, they just pump water up to the top. And then when electricity is in demand, it runs back down and they generate it. So pumped hydro is an oldie but a goodie. It's been around for a long time, but we're going to need a lot more of it. And it's one of my passions. In fact, I started the construction of what will be one of the biggest pumped hydro schemes in the world something called Snowy Hydro 2.0, which is being built now. But again, takes time to build these things. We all know about Moore's law, about processing speeds doubling every 18 months. Well, all I can say is Moore's law does not apply to digging holes. So you've got to get started early.
I want to talk about now public-private partnerships. I've seen people in the audience, people that worked formerly at the White House.
Yep.
Isabel, hello. You were, obviously, you've rode both those horses. You've been in the private and obviously as a Prime Minister. How do you get, it's got to work, haven't we? We've got to work together. We're not going to solve this with arguments between the state and private sector. How do you think that axis needs to work or can work for us in sustainability and biodiversity protection?
Well, often the private sector is ahead of government and politics on climate. I mean, if you think about it, if you take the fossil fuel sector out of it, who of course have a vested interest in burning coal or oil or gas or whatever, if you take them out of it to one side, the rest of the business community, I think, globally, is actually more activist and more advanced in their ambitions than most governments are, truthfully. And you saw that at the COP in Glasgow. I mean, Secretary John Kerry, who is President Biden's climate envoy, has really done an amazing job marshalling some of the largest companies in the world to get behind the climate goals in a first movers coalition. And while I don't take anything away from John Kerry's advocacy, he couldn't have done it if there hadn't been so much enthusiasm. So in fact, and in the UK, one of the leading voices in mobilising business to a climate action agenda has been King Charles. When he's Prince of Wales, he's had led a number of initiatives there. So I think business has a voice. It can lead by example, but ultimately, you need government to sort of mobilise the whole community. I mean, only a government could enact the Inflation Reduction Act, a sort of rather bizarrely named climate legislation that was recently passed. I mean, who cares, as long as it works? A rose by any other name would smell so sweet, etc. But you needed government to do that. But I think generally business doesn't need persuading. I think that you're preaching to the choir with the business community.
Brilliant. In our last 30 seconds, I've got a little countdown thing going on here, which is very good. Our last 30 seconds for people in the audience today, what is the one thing that people could really do to make a difference?
Well, I always say vote. I mean, there is nothing more important than people expressing their democratic wishes. We in Australia, we make it compulsory. We care so much about voting, we fine you $100 if you don't. And we make it compulsory to be on the roll. And the job of the Electoral Commission is to make sure everyone over the age of 18 is on the roll and that they vote. And so I think, at a practical level, standing up and being counted is vital. History is made by those who turn up. But also from a business point of view, particularly your industry, you are the great ambassadors for a clean environment. You are the great ambassadors for the pristine environments that we need to maintain and to restore. And your clients, your customers, the people travelling around the world, their experiences collectively have weight when they are communicated to their friends, their families, and above all to those who they elect to represent them in their respective countries' parliaments and congresses and so forth. But ultimately, one word answer, vote.
Well, former President of Australia, Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, that was magnificent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.